welcome to another Swordmaster Publications presentation. My name is Ernie Lawrence. Today we will be studying Judges chapter 3. Judges chapter 3 begins the more detailed exploration of specific judges and specific time periods within the 300 or so years, 300 and a half century or so years of the reign of judges before we get to Samuel and Saul and the kings. So we're going to get right into it. We're going to cover three judges today in the book of Judges chapter 3. And in this is one of the funnier stories that you read about in the Bible. There's violence, of course. A lot of what's going on here is violent, but in this there's a little bit of comedy as well. I don't think intentional, but a lot of us are going to find it a bit humorous just because of what goes on. So let's go ahead and get started into Judges chapter 3. It says, "Now these are the nations which Jehovah left to prove Israel by them, even as many of Israel as had not known all the wars of Canaan." So when it says that God left these, this is showing God's permission of that he is permitting what the Israelites did when they moved into the land. He gives them the land. He says, "This is your land. Go take it." They go take it. God declares, "You've taken it." All right. His promise of giving them this land is completely fulfilled. It's declared fulfilled, even though the Israelites chose to leave so many of the cities and the people that were in the land. They did not completely drive them out as God told them they should. So they didn't obey God in that. All right. And even though God declares that the land promise is fulfilled, that Israel does indeed control the promised land, remember there are more than 2 million people that have moved in and taken over these city-states. They have victory over everybody that they fight because God is with them when they fight. But they don't drive everybody out for one reason or another. And so here we have a declaration of God permitting them to make that choice, that God is not forcing them to do anything. I think this says a lot about free will. And I think this also shows a lot about how God works through man's choices to do things, including to teach. And so God leaves these to prove Israel. That's kind of like we talk about the purifying, the testing, when you forge a sword or something along those lines, or some kind of metal instrument, you're going to have a proving of it that purifies it and makes it better by getting rid of all the impurities. And I think that's what the idea here is with proving Israel by them. Even as many of Israel as had not known all the wars of Canaan. And so this is looking forward into those generations that had not known the time of Joshua and the conquering of the promised land. Verse 2 says, "Only that the generations of the children of Israel might know, to teach them war, at the least such as before knew nothing thereof." So part of this proving here is God allows these nations to stay to strengthen them. It's in a way kind of like an athletic event, that they would have practice of warfare to prepare them to fight against other nations that would come in from the outside. You would have these generations that would grow up if there had been no other nations, or they hadn't left these city-states in this area, then you would have ended up having generation after generation after generation not knowing war at all. And because the Israelites chose to go this route of leaving these nations here and become corrupted, there was a weakness that came with doing that God mitigated by having them have to constantly fight. And so you could have been strengthened one way. You would have had this idea of spiritual strength, and God would have protected them one way had they completely cleared out the land. They didn't go that route. They went this other route. So they're constantly having to wage the spiritual warfare against these false gods, but God preserves them anyway, because that's his whole goal, is to preserve the Israelites, to bring the Messiah into the world. He preserves them through constant battle. Generation after generation, they're having to fight against these encroaching nations that constantly rise up and fight against them. So that by the time we get to King David and King Solomon and all of these other great kings, Israel is physically prepared by God to handle their greater adversaries. Even to the point when we start to see the big nations coming in, Assyria and Babylon and Egypt and all of these other surrounding massive empires coming in. Judah and Jerusalem, to a lesser extent Israel, are able to survive that, because of this strengthening that God is doing right now. And again, it's because of the pathway that they chose. Israel made this choice. They went this direction, and God's God. He's omnipotent. He's omniscient. He can use their choices to do his will and accomplish what he set out to accomplish. And I think that is exactly what the book of Judges here is really given to us. Again, I believe it was written by Samuel. So to show us how God was using their choices in order to preserve Israel, so that Messiah would come into the world through them and fulfill the promise to Abraham. All right, so verse 3, namely 5 lords of the Philistines, and all the Canaanites, and the Sidonians, the Hivites that dwelt in Mount Lebanon, from Mount Baal Hermon unto the entering of in of Hamath. So I got a map here of this. This is along the western coast by the Mediterranean Sea, the western edge of the Promised Land. Sorry, I dry throat today. You have this western edge along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, all the way up into the north area. This is where this contention comes from. And one of the big things that you're going to see in the book of Judges is that these wars and the judges that fight and release Israel from their captivity, it's not the whole of Israel. It's parts of Israel here, parts of Israel there. You're going to have parts that aren't mentioned at all. And these nations are not enormous nations. The tribes, in one sense, are independent. They don't have a king. They have their elders. They have their princes, the ones that rule over the tribes. And then you have the priesthood, and they're kind of a federation. Israel right now is a kind of a federation of the tribes. And so when we look at the corruption that happens, only happens in part. And that's why you get some overlapping of these judges that have to save only parts of Israel, and we can see that some of these judges are cotemporal. They're happening at the same time, which is what allows us to get the 348 years that is consistent with the Bible timeline that we see in Kings versus what we see in the Pentateuch and in Joshua. And so understand that. So these guys are from the north and from the west, and here you can see a map. Down here is the Sea of Galilee, and you keep going, you'll get down to the Dead Sea down in this area. You got the crossing of the Jordan River and all of that, where Jerusalem is, but this is all up in the northern area, like the super north part of the Israelite Promised Land. Okay, so here's Sidon, Tyre, and this is also called Zidon, but Tyre and Sidon, they are constant throughout the Old Testament. You'll see them even into the days leading up to the intertestamental period. Tyre and Sidon are going to be talked about, and they're major city-states in terms of the history of the Israelites. So that's who they're fighting against at this moment in time. All right. So verse 4 says, and they were to prove Israel by them, to know whether they would hearken unto the commandments of Jehovah, which he commanded their fathers by the hand of Moses. So they were to prove that they, there as these five lords of the Philistines and all these others, were to prove Israel by them to know. Who needs to know this? God doesn't need to know. He's omniscient. Who's the one that needs to know whether or not they would hearken to the commandments of Jehovah or not? The Israelites do. This is God testing them through fire of their surrounding nations, and really putting that pressure on them to show the Israelites, all right, when as we say, the rubber meets the road, who are the ones that are going to remain faithful to God during this time when these encroaching nations are trying to come and say, worship our gods, we'll trade with you, that kind of thing. And so that's what's going on here. God doesn't need to know these things. He already knows. He's omniscient. He's omnitemporal. That word. He already sees the future. He knows who's going to be faithful. But this is showing to the Israelites who's going to be faithful. And it says, verse 5, and the children of Israel dwelt among the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. If those 6 names sound familiar, those are the 6 nations that they were supposed to completely drive out. They defeated all of their armies, but they left the cities. They left the women and the children and the old and the non-combatants, and instead they took their cities, and they left the people there to be among them and to kind of be these I guess second-class citizens, if you will. They weren't slaves, but they weren't citizens either. And so there was this kind of service that was going on as a subjugated people or an occupied people, but they allowed them to stay in among them without driving them out like God had said to do. So what happens naturally? Verse 6, and they took their daughters to be their wives, and gave their daughters to their sons, and served their gods. So yes, the natural course of things, you're walking down the street, you're a young Israelite man, you see this pretty young woman there, and she just happens to be one of the occupied nations. She's one of those people, and she's cute. So you get to talking to her, and eventually you get married. Oh, but she serves these other gods. Or you're an Israelite, and your daughter is walking about in her daily business, and she sees a handsome young man, and he happens to be a descendant of one of these occupied peoples, and they allow the intermarrying here, and they are not Israelites. They don't proselytize. They worship these false gods, and through a generation of this happening, they fall out of faithfulness to God. They choose to worship these fake false gods because the marriage is such a powerful draw. That conflict, well, I'm going to worship God. Well, I'm not going to worship your God. I'm going to go do this thing over here. I'm an atheist, or I'm a pagan, or I follow after this new age, or whatever. You have this conflict that goes in to a marriage, and this is what part of what God is proving: who's going to stay faithful to God with this kind of pressure. And we see that a lot of the children of Israel that were around the borders of these nations that were being talked about, they weren't faithful. And this is in the north, and you have a lot of tribes that are in the north, and we see this time and time again in the northern tribes, that they did fall into paganism a lot more than the southern tribes, where we have Judah, Benjamin, and Levi. All right, so verse 7, and the children of Israel did evil in the sight of Jehovah, and forgat Jehovah their God, and served Balaam and the groves. And I'm going to talk about the groves here, because you're going to see this a whole lot. What does the groves represent? This is Ashtoreth. This is that goddess of life and spring and fertility. We talked about the Easter eggs and the bunnies and all of that. The groves are part of that. So when you see Balaam, those are the lords, the false gods that are the really representative of the male side of things, and then Ashtoreth is the female goddess that they worship that represented life and birth and all of that kind of stuff. So this isn't anything new from chapter 2. It's the same things. It's just stated differently, and it really has more to do with the practical side of their worship. They would go worship in these groves of trees, and they would worship the trees, and they would worship Ashtoreth. And this is the way that they would do it. So, verse 8, the result, therefore the anger of Jehovah was hot against Israel, and he sold them into the hand of it's Cushan Rishathaim. Cushan Rishathaim, and that's a big long word, but you practice it a few times. It's really not that difficult to say. And he's the king of Mesopotamia, and the children of Israel served Cushan Rishathaim 8 years. So this guy who is again like right along the border of the Mediterranean Sea. When we see Mesopotamia, Mesopotamia is kind of that region that we're talking about there. And it says that he sold them. This idea of God selling them means that he allowed this king to come in and see, hey, Israel's kind of at a time of peace. I could go in and conquer. I could go in and I could kind of turn things around, and I could make it to where at least these tribes are under my control. And so he does that, and he does it for 8 years. It's not a very long time, and this is kind of Israel stepping into it. We see that they're unfaithful. This is during that time of peace after Joshua has gone, and after the next generation that was kind of part of Joshua's generation, and kind of after the ones that survived him. At the end of that is when they're unfaithful, and then they get enslaved or oppressed, I guess, for about 8 years. And then the children of Israel remember God. They're like, oh yeah, we serve this God who can take care of this problem for us. And so they cried unto Jehovah, and Jehovah raised up a deliverer to the children of Israel, who delivered them, even Othniel, the son of Kenaz, who is Caleb's younger brother. So Caleb has a younger brother, Kenaz, and he has this nephew, Othniel. And if you'll remember back in Judges chapter 1 and in Joshua, that Othniel ends up helping to take, I think it was Joshua 15, he ends up taking this particular area, and Caleb's like, okay, you can have my daughter Aksa to marry. And then he gives them wells, and there's this whole thing that goes on. So Caleb's nephew marries his daughter. We're just outside of the Levitical incest range in terms of marrying somebody who is within a certain degree of separation from you. Like, you couldn't marry your aunt, you couldn't marry your niece or whatever. So Caleb, or let's say Kenaz, could not have married Caleb's daughter, but Kenaz's son Othniel could, because you have enough degree of separation to satisfy the law of Moses. But anyway, Othniel is that generation after Caleb, and so he comes in, and he's the first of the judges. And it says the Spirit of Jehovah came upon him, and he judged Israel and went out to war. And Jehovah delivered Cushan Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia, into his hand, and his hand prevailed against Cushan Rishathaim. Now, I want to state something here, and this is a whole. I don't want to say tangent, because the Bible doesn't do tangents, but this is a deep topic that could be its own video. When we think about salvation, it is important to understand that nobody that lived before the cross was saved before the cross. And I want to clarify that. When you look at people like Moses and David and Solomon, and in this case Othniel, and all of these people who were faithful to God, God counted them righteous. He put, I guess, if you will, salvation on credit. In other words, they were looking forward to the coming of the Messiah when their sins would actually be forgiven. So you have this kind of setting aside of their sin through the sacrificial system, through their faithfulness, all of the things that they did, but they didn't actually have true salvation until Christ came and died on the cross, because that's the only way that mankind can be saved, is by the blood of Christ. And these men, during this the Old Testament period, were faithful to God. And if we look at it from a timeline perspective, these men will be saved when the Messiah is crucified. And I'm saying all of this to point out the fact that Othniel is not saved, but he is declared righteous because of his faithfulness. That being said, he has the Spirit of God, and this is why I'm making the point. You can have the Spirit of God and not be saved. You can have the Spirit of God in you and not be washed in the blood of the Lamb. And this is so important, because there are so many people who teach that when you are indwelt by the Holy Spirit, that means you're saved. And if that is the case, then Othniel, who has the Spirit of God, is saved without Christ having died yet. And it means that those who are lost can be saved by some other means, by some other method, than by the blood of Jesus Christ. And that makes Jesus' statements, "I am the way," incorrect. And it's so powerful to understand this, because then when people go to Cornelius in Acts chapter 10 and 11 and say, see, Cornelius was immersed in the Holy Spirit before he was baptized, and so therefore Cornelius was saved before he was immersed in water. No, he was not saved. You can be indwelt by the Holy Spirit without being saved. There's no necessary conclusion to draw there to say that you have to be purified, you have to be washed in the blood, you have to be regenerated in order to have the Spirit of God. He's omnipotent. He can do whatever he wants. You're his creation. And so the Spirit of God can come upon you even though you are still going to have those sins not washed away by the blood of Christ. And so that's what the point I wanted to make here in verse 10. The Spirit of the Lord comes upon Othniel, and it guides him and tells him the things that he needs to do, and gives him all the things that he needs to free Israel. But Othniel is still an Israelite. He is not washed in the blood. He has to look forward to the cross for that to eventually happen. Othniel is going to be in Hades, in Abraham's bosom, waiting for that to take place, so that he could truly be saved from his sins. And that's how all of the faithful of the Old Testament are. They're not truly saved until Christ dies on the cross. They're just kind of made righteous or declared righteous on credit. All right, verse 11. Othniel has won. It says the land had rest for 40 years. And then Othniel, the son of Kenaz, died. So Kenaz, remember, is Caleb's younger brother. Caleb's already died. Kenaz dies. And then Othniel, after 40 years of ruling in peace, dies. During this 40 years, towards the end of that 40 years, you're going to see that the Israelites are going to start to move towards this corruption. They don't really do a great deal of it because Othniel's still around, but they start to move in that direction. A lot of people will look at the book of Judges and they will say, I see 8 years here of oppression, I see 40 years here of peace, and they don't give any time for there to be this corruption that takes place, because that doesn't happen in a day. And so you have to find out when would this corruption start to happen, and it usually happens towards the end of a judge's reign, and then the oppression generally happens because the judge is no longer there to kind of provide that protection, and that's when the oppression begins again. And so that's why I say that a lot of the judges overlap in their time periods. And I'm going to show that here with this next part. It says that the children of Israel did evil again in the sight of Jehovah, and Jehovah strengthened Eglon, the king of Moab, against Israel, because they had done evil in the sight of Jehovah. Now, Moab, and we're going to see here, and I'll just read verse 13. And he gathered unto him, that is the king of Moab, Eglon, gathers unto him the children of Ammon and Amalek. And they went and smote Israel and possessed the city of palm trees. So this, Moab, Ammon, and Amalek are down in the south part. These are the first people that the Israelites encountered. So we're talking about Reuben and Gad, essentially in this part of it. They're on the outside of the Jordan, and these are the people that are being they're coming in to accost the Israelites, corrupt them, and to fight against Israel because Reuben and Gad at this time are following after the ways of these false gods. Totally different geographical area. And so there can be this overlap between what we see with Othniel and with this new judge that we're going to see, Ehud, that comes up. There's no reason that you can't have that overlap, and if we understand that, then the time parts of this make sense when we start doing the chronologies and stuff. So verse 14, so the children of Israel served Eglon, the king of Moab, 18 years. So this is a longer period of time than the tribes that were under the king of Mesopotamia. And God lets them kind of stew for a little bit. And then it says, when the children of Israel cried unto Jehovah, so they repent, they turn back to Jehovah, God save us, Jehovah raises up a deliverer, Ehud, the son of Gera, a Benjamite. So again, Benjamin, the tribe of Benjamin, is right there at the Jordan. So he's very local towards Gad. I'm sorry, not Gad. Reuben and Gad. So over there, they are geographically very close. And so he comes from Benjamin, and it says that he's a man that's left-handed, which is a rare enough thing. And so people typically, when they talk about weapons, like where they're going to sheathe their weapons, they're going to sheathe them where the right hand can get to them. So across the shoulder here, or if they're going to secrete a dagger, they're going to do it on their left leg or whatever. And it says, by him the children of Israel sent a present unto Eglon, the king of Moab. And Ehud made him a dagger which had two edges, a cubit in length. That's from fingertip to elbow. That is a long dagger. All right, I want you to know just how long that dagger is. And he put it under his raiment, under his right thigh. Because remember, he's left-handed. So when they check him as if he would be a right-handed man. They check his left leg. They don't really bother to check his right leg because they don't realize that he's left-handed. And so he brings the present. He's got this present to Eglon, king of Moab. And Eglon was a very fat man. And I told you that there's going to be a little bit of humor here. So we can imagine this big, rotund guy. It really gets expressive about just how fat this guy was. But he's this Jabba the Hutt dude that is the king of Moab. We're talking a symbol of gluttony and greed and just, how does this guy even in power? Why are people listening to him? Because he can't even barely move. And it says in verse 18, when he had made an end to offer the present, he sent away the people that bear the present. All right. But he himself turned again from the quarries that were by Gilgal and said, I have a secret errand unto thee, O king, who said, keep silence. And all that stood by him went out from him. So they deliver the present. This entourage delivers the present. And as everybody's gone out, Ehud turns back to Eglon and says, hey, I've got a secret I've got to tell you. This is something that I need to just tell you. And the king, oh, okay, all right. What's this guy going to do? Is he going to offer me some kind of probably thinking here that he's going to get some secret over Israel because these guys have brought me tribute, and maybe he's going to give me some inside information. I'll gain even more power. And so what does he do? He sends out all of his other people. He says, "Go, everybody, go out. I'm going to talk to this guy Ehud, who brought me this gift. You can trust him. He brought a gift. He's a good guy, right?" And so all that stand by him went out from him. And Ehud comes into him, and he was sitting in a summer parlor. Some think that this was actually like a toilet, but he's sitting in this parlor which he had for himself alone. So he's there by himself. That's why a lot of people think it was the toilet. And Ehud said, "I have a message from God unto thee." And he arose out of his seat. So this seat that Eglon is sitting in, he gets up out of it, and he's like, "Oh, you got a message for me from your God." And Ehud comes to him and put forth his left hand and took the dagger from his right thigh. So, he's like, "I got a message from God for you." Grabs the dagger and thrusts it into his belly. Now, remember, this thing's a cubit long, elbow to fingertip. And the haft also went in after the blade. So when he stabs him, like, he almost loses his hand. He goes in so far. The blade is just buried in this fat guy. And the fat closed up on the blade. Imagine a cubit long dagger goes into this guy all the way and is completely covered up, so that people don't actually see that there's a dagger in him. And Ehud can't draw the dagger back out because this guy is so fat. And it says, "And the dirt came out." That dirt is not a really good translation. That dirt is the dude pooped. Like, that's what happened. He killed him, and he released everything. And that's why a lot of people say, well, he was probably on the toilet because he was already going to the bathroom. His bowels were already kind of positioned to do that. He's like, "Hold on, let me pull up my pants." And then he comes out and he talks to Ehud. Ehud stabs him, and everything just comes out. As gross, this whole thing is gross, but there's just this kind of, I don't know, weird humor going on here. So it says, "Then Ehud went forth through the porch and shut the doors of the parlor upon him and locked them." So basically he's like, "All right, you're in the toilet. I'm going to leave you on the toilet." Locks the doors. And when he had gone out, his servants came, and when they saw that, behold, the doors of the parlor were locked, they said, "Surely he covers his feet in his summer chambers." They're saying, covering his feet as his pants are down. They think that he's going to the bathroom. He's locked the door, so we're just going to let him sit there on the throne for a little while, right, until he gets it all out. And they're not going to bother him while this. And again, this is why a lot of people think that he was going. This was like a restroom. He was going potty, and so they leave him there for a little while, and Ehud is able to make his escape because of that. And they tarried till they were ashamed. So they wait there for a while, and then they're like starting to look at each other, and they're like, "Why is the king taking so long to go potty?" And it says, "Behold, he opened not the doors of the parlor." He doesn't open the doors. They're like, "What's going on?" Therefore they took a key and opened them. They finally realized, hey, something. They waited for a while, because a guy on the potty, guys, we can be there for a while. We got a newspaper, we got our phones, we're playing some video games or whatever. We can sit there for a while. We can daydream and stare at nothing for a while. Half an hour. This guy was on the potty for a while. And they get embarrassed about this. And then they finally start to think maybe something's wrong. So they take a key, they open it up, and behold, their Lord was falling down dead on the ground. And they're like, "Oh." And so Ehud escaped while they tarried, and passed beyond the quarries, and escaped unto Sirath. So he makes his escape. Eglon is dead, and the children are freed. And it came to pass, when he was come, that he blew a trumpet in the mountain of Ephraim, and the children of Israel went down with him from the mount, and he before them. And he said unto me, "Follow after me, for Jehovah has delivered your enemies, the Moabites, into your hand." They went down after him, and he took the fords of Jordan toward Moab, and suffered not a man to pass over. Okay, so he announces, "Hey, God's given us victory. Let's go take it." And they go down to Jordan. Again, this is Benjamin crossing over Jordan because of where the Moabites were. And it says that they slew of Moab at that time about 10,000 men, all lusty and all men of valor, and there escaped not a man. So they take out another army. The Moabite army, bolstered by the Ammonites and the Amalekites, and they take them out. And they win. God It says, so Moab was subdued that day under the hand of Israel, and the land had rest fourscore years, which is 80 years that their rest. All right, and then it says, and just kind of as an aside here, right after Ehud, and after him was Shamgar the son of Anath, which slew the Philistines 600 men with an ox goad, and he also delivered Israel. So there's another judge, but the Philistines are over in the south along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. And so you have these different hotspots around Israel where all of this is happening, and they are delivered out wherever their location is. They're delivered out by these judges that God sends. A little bit of overlap, but it's a pattern, and it's a pattern that continues for the next, you know, several centuries until we get into the time period of Babylon and all of the things that happened after Babylon and the captivity there, and then the intertestamental period, even up into the time of Rome. We see the Israelites going after false gods and the money that comes with these foreign nations. Even the Herods were notorious for doing this, even so much as they said that they gave up their power to Rome. And the Israelites don't ever learn their lesson. Some of them do. Some of the individuals do. But as a system, as a nation, they never learn their lesson, and we see the end result of that. So thank you for being with me. Again, subscribe, like, hit the alarm bell so you get notifications. Leave comments. Love discussing this stuff. Look forward to those comments always. And hopefully we'll see you guys next time. My name is Ernie Lawrence. This has been another Swordmaster Publications presentation.